The film begins with Jacor Lincoln, an ambitious young rapper roaming the streets of Oakland at night until he arrives at his target's house. Armed with 2 guns, he silently sneaks through the backyards while the man he's looking for, Malcolm, is preparing for a relaxing evening with his girlfriend after a night of drinking. But before that, they stop by their daughter's room to say goodnight. At that moment, they come face to face with Jacor, who raises his guns toward Malcolm and asks if he remembers his face. Malcolm tries to stay calm and claims he remembers him as a friend, but for Jacor, that was the wrong answer, and he shoots both Malcolm and his girlfriend. In the next scene, we see the protagonist in court for this crime, with the victim's daughter and grandmother present, the latter wishing that he burns in hell. Despite the suffering he caused, Jacor shows no remorse and doesn't think to explain why he pulled the trigger. For obvious reasons, he ends up in prison, sentenced to life, and must quickly adapt to his new environment. While exploring the prison yard, he encounters various groups, from fathers to young men arrested for drug trafficking. It's not much different from the neighborhood he lived in, except now he's surrounded by walls. This reminds him of his life 13 years ago, when he was a bullied child and befriended another boy who was also bullied, Lamarck. Lamarck believed he could escape the neighborhood by doing the right thing, while Jacor's dream seemed impossible. However, he enjoyed spending time with Lamarck, especially since going home always meant getting beaten by his delinquent father, J.D. His mother, Delonda, tried to protect him, but his father used the typical excuse that he was toughening him up to survive the streets. Over time, Jacor accepted this excuse and gained the courage to take revenge on the school bullies. But by giving in to hate, he lost his friendship with Lamarck, though he gained the loyalty of TQ, another kid who had suffered similarly. 13 months before killing Malcolm, Jacor and TQ were small-time criminals making their living through armed robbery. What complicated matters was TQ's temper, as he never hesitated to hit anyone who disrespected him. One day, Lamarck visited them at their music studio after being injured during his military service. Despite this, he still had plans to leave the neighborhood, but TQ pointed out that he didn't need to, offering him a stack of cash, which Lamarck quickly understood how it was earned. While TQ was busy greeting some visitors, Jacor began practicing a rap song, surprising Lamarck with his rapping skills. After finishing, Jacor stepped outside to see TQ negotiating with Malcolm. In prison, a criminal approaches Jacor, introducing himself as Rollo, the younger brother of Big Stuna, the gang leader Jacor worked for when he was free. Rollo offers him protection from Malcolm's men in prison. Later, Jacor is provoked by another inmate in line, but before things escalate, someone from his past intervenes. His father, J.D., who had spent a long time in prison and knew how to survive. In another flashback, we see Jacor and TQ at the funeral of a young neighbor who was killed by Malcolm. According to Big Stuna, Jacor's father had spiraled into disaster due to the drugs Malcolm supplied him, earning their sympathy. On the other hand, Jacor was spending time with his girlfriend, Shantai, who surprised him with the news that she was pregnant. She had hesitated to tell him for a week, fearing his reaction. Though he celebrated the news and assured her he would take care of everything, behind her back, he was trying to land a legitimate job. Eventually, he got a chance and shared the good news with Lamarck, rekindling the harmony they once shared. In the present, after seeing his father in prison laughing with his friends, Jacor remembers the day he was expelled from school for following in his father's footsteps. Deonda grew angry with him, reminding him that the bills were piling up, and all he did was smoke. Furious, JD explained that there was no point in raising his son properly, since he would end up in prison just like him. The protagonist receives an unwanted visit from his mother, who feels guilty seeing him in this place. In response, Jacor admits that the real culprit is imprisoned with him behind the same walls. Deonda, devastated, acknowledges that JD wasn't the best father, but he always wanted the best for him until he fell into the trap of drugs. Therefore, she asks him to take responsibility for his younger son, Sion. In the next flashback, we see Jacor and Shantae attending Stuna's birthday party, despite the feud with Malcolm, where all of Stuna's allies were out in the streets celebrating as a show of loyalty. Even though things were calm, it was Stuna who fired the first shots at 2 men staring at him, convinced they were Malcolm's men. Back in prison, the protagonist receives a letter from his girlfriend, accompanied by a picture sent by his mother. In the picture, Yakor appears as a newborn in the arms of a proud JD. It was a picture he had often stared at in his childhood to remind himself that his father wasn't all bad. Moved by these memories, he meets his father in the yard and tells him about his own son. In response, his father suggests that he stop accepting family visits, arguing that both of them are poor examples for children. This reminds him of his late grandmother, who always defended him against criticism, especially when he was expelled from school. She was the only one who could control JD to some extent, making it clear that his violent lifestyle wasn't suitable for everyone, especially his son. Later, Yakor confided in Stuna about his ambitions to become a rapper. Stuna promised him a chance in the industry with one small condition. He had to work for him first to see if he was as tough as TQ claimed, who described him as the best skinny fighter. On another occasion, while Yakor was spending time with TQ, the latter received a visit from Trex, a local gang member who claimed to be a musician. From the moment he met Yakor, Trex would crack offensive jokes about his girlfriend, even showing him an adult video as proof of the alleged side hustle Shantae was involved in. Afterward, Yakor immediately returned home to confront his girlfriend, who admitted that she had gone off track after her brother's death, but that was before she met him. Despite this, Yakor was still furious and demanded that she pack his things and give him the car keys so he could leave, showing no concern for the fact that she was carrying his child. Of course, he wasn't going to leave behind his favorite dogs. The next day, while working at a shoe store, Yakor overheard one of the managers speaking poorly about him to another colleague, claiming that he only pretended to be a criminal because of his skin color, and that he was nothing compared to her boyfriend, who was a real hustler able to meet all her needs. After leaving work, Yakor and TQ teamed up to track down that woman and her successful boyfriend, but they changed their minds when they realized they were approaching an upscale neighborhood filled with police patrols. Just as they were about to leave, the police stopped them out of suspicion. During a later interrogation, Yakor learned that TQ had a kilogram of cocaine in his car. The detective used this as leverage to try to extract information about the gang wars, asking if it was true that TQ was secretly collaborating with Malcolm to unite their organizations behind Stuna's back. The protagonist remained as silent as a grave, so he was released. The story of the drugs in TQ's car was merely an attempt to provoke him. At his next meeting with Stuna, Yakor proudly showcased some of his new music, although Trex dismissed it as ordinary. This reminded Yakor of his father, who was never impressed by what he did, not to belittle him, but because he wanted him to be better, and above all, not follow in his footsteps. This was something his mother always told him, and surprisingly, JD agreed. In the present in prison, JD warns his son not to trust anyone sent by TQ, as there are suspicions that TQ is working for Malcolm's gang, which seeks revenge for the death of their leader. JD offers to protect his son, but Yakor responds that he can take care of himself. In another flashback, we see the protagonist visiting his friend Lamarck in the hospital, where he discovers that Lamarck's injury is worse than expected, with the possibility that he may never walk again. Furious, Yakor considered this unfair, as Lamarck was the last person who deserved it. Enraged, he went to Stuna and offered to kill Malcolm, the man ruining Stuna's business. Stuna agreed to his offer, and his wife provided Yakor with information about Malcolm, who was set to visit his girlfriend and daughter that night. Of course, the essential tools weren't missing: a pair of new guns. The rest of the story you already know, with one small detail added. Before entering the house, Malcolm was talking to Trex about TQ's role in his organization. As Yakor watched them from his hiding spot, he remembered the day he, as a small child, saw his father buying drugs from a young Malcolm. After JD left, Yakor asked the dealer to stop selling drugs to his father, but Malcolm laughed and said he wouldn't lose his best customer. Now you know why Yakor pulled the trigger years later. After the crime, Yakor had nowhere to go but Shantae's house, where he asked her to hide his guns. In a moment of distraction, Yakor stashed some money in the furniture. Shantae asked him who he had killed, but he refused to answer, explaining that things in the neighborhood would get better. Then he invited her to sit next to him and apologized for their previous fight. They ended up watching a comedy show until they fell asleep. The calm before the storm. At dawn, a police squad raided the house and arrested Jacques. After recalling how he ended up in prison, he called his girlfriend to admit that he was ready to meet his son and take responsibility for him, despite all odds. Shantae replied that while he may see the walls surrounding him, his son doesn't. As he prepared for this meeting, the protagonist learned from Rollo that TQ had been arrested and would be transferred to the same prison. Upon hearing this, Jacques remembered all the evidence of TQ's secret alliance with Malcolm. At the same time, Stuna and his wife discovered that Trex was also involved, so they ruthlessly killed him. Now it was Jacques' turn to finish the job. In the prison yard, TQ approached Jacques as if nothing had happened, but he was planning to stab him with a handmade shank. However, Jacques anticipated this, and after a struggle, managed to stab TQ first, while Rollo and his men covered for him to prevent the guards from noticing. A few days later, Jacques received a visit from his mother, girlfriend, and son Sion, which brought him immense joy. Inspired by this experience, he later taught his father how to garden in the prison yard. As he watched his father following his lead, the film cuts to a shot of Jacques as a newborn, with JD holding him in his arms, saying he would make something of his life. It may not have turned out that way, but at least they have each other. And so this remarkable story comes to an end.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.